Table 1 then sets out the lag in detail. And if you turn the page at 173, we have a table which sets out the remuneration picture post the October 12 proposed wage increases. And ultimately you see that after the proposed October 2012 wage increases, the gap between Lonmin and Impala would narrow to 300 Rand per month. Do you see that?
Yes. May I just say that in the original document, the trade union scenarios document, the section on the contagion is at page 148, page 25 of that document. A number of scenarios are listed, there are 4 of them in fact, on page 147, which is page 24 of the document. The first one is the implat scenario, brackets the contagion.
Do you want me to look at that, Chair?
Well, if we can, I didn't want to interrupt this today, but in as much reference is made to the contagion, what exactly is meant by that? You correctly said it's really the implat scenario, and what you say appears to be, in fact is, supported by the passage I referred to, page 148.
Okay.
And then it's expanded further in the following page.
Yes. Yeah.
Now, if we can turn to page 174 of the document, Mr. Jamison. At 4.2, I'm sorry, at 4.3, we deal, the document sets out the risk profile. And at 4.3.1, one of the risks identified is the retention of RDOs. We've already discussed that. At 4.3.2, the demands from other job categories for wage increases. So the ripple effect of granting increases to one identified group.
Yes.
At 4.3.3, the lack of discipline and control by union leadership. And in the first bullet point under that risk identified, it's indicated that the direct engagement between the RDOs and their non-union representatives at Career Mind with management may serve to undermine current recognition agreements with existing unions. Do you see that?
Yes.
And the second bullet point, this may also be seen by the unions as an attempt by management to undermine unions and to divide and rule them. Now, the key strategic question that's posed immediately after that is whether Lonmin wants the historical majoritarian trade union environment. And the question is posed whether Lonmin can conceive of a future of multi-union trade union environment in which multiple unions share significant representation. Do you see that?
Yes.
Now, may I ask whether this key strategic question that's posed in this document, whether this question was ever fully considered by EXCO?
No, I can't recall us having a great debate on it. Two things I can recall which might help. In 4.3.3, where there's a reference to undermine current recognition agreements, I can recall that Barnard and Mark Munro had a discussion where Barnard was quite concerned about this issue and made it clear that we mustn't be negotiating in these discussions that Mike DeCosta is having with the RDOs. We mustn't be giving any indication that bargaining units are going to be reopened or negotiations being reopened. Not to say that we might not, but we shouldn't be raising expectations. And he had a concern. Mark answered that by saying, no, this is absolutely just consultation, and Mike is doing what he should be doing in talking to his employees and trying to ascertain exactly what it is they want and why. That I recall from 433, so you've got those 2 bullet points there. And I think that was a valid concern on there. The key strategic questions don't have don't have a recollection of a debate on that. If there was, I don't think I was participating in it.
All right, we'll come back to the discussions or consultations between Mr. Da Costa and the RDOs.
Okay. Right.
I just wanted us to then go back to the discussion we had just before the tea break, and that was we left off at page 84 of the bundle.
Before you do that, can I raise a matter which, but if I'm going to indicate what it is, and if it's going to trespass on your territory, just let me know and I won't proceed with it. Various scenarios which are described as October 2012 scenarios are set out just below paragraph 4.3.3 on page 175 through to some of the pages thereafter. It appears to end at 178. But what appears from the document is that Lonman, as far as one can see, wanted what it called the advantage of some stability and certainty in the company. And that is discussed in subparagraph D at page 177 on the scenario of AMCU reaching the 35% threshold requirement. And there it says, if AMCU reaches this threshold requirement, then they'd have to enjoy all the benefits of recognition. Under risk, there's no risk. And under operational, it said, the full legal integration of AMCU into the union structures of Lonman would have the advantage of bringing some stability and certainty in the company. And then it says that the next one, under political, NUM would still resist the integration of AMCU into the union structures of Lonman, but proceeds this political stance by NUM would not have any legal basis. Now, was this aspect of the matter discussed? Was it discussed that it would actually be an advantage to Lonman if AMCU could reach the 35% threshold, because then there would be what I think is discussed elsewhere as being a multi-union approach, and that this would bring stability to some extent at least. Was that discussed at all?
I can't remember that, Mr. Chairman. No, sorry.
Yes.
Thank you, Chair. If we can then go back to page 84, Mr. Jamison, just to pick up where we were after the 18th of July EXCO meeting. So even though I've unfortunately just taken you to June, the last point in the timeline where we were is in July 2012.
Right.
And we know that EXCO left it on the basis that Barnard McQueen is to prepare an opinion on on the implications of the three issues which we discussed earlier, namely the inter-union rivalry and the implications of that, the implications of addressing the demands of the RDOs at that point in time, and the implications of potentially reopening wage negotiations. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, just to summarize what we've traversed thus far, I'm going to put certain propositions to you just to conclude,
Okay.
And then we'll move on in the timeline. And the first, Mr. Jamison, is what we see from the period of April to 18 July 2012 is the following. Firstly, an appreciation by EXCO that Lonman RDOs are paid significantly less than RDOs at Implats and Amplats. Do you see that? And Anglo.
Yes.
We also see an appreciation by EXCO that NUM was fast losing support and that they may not or may no longer be the legitimate voice of the workers of London. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes.
We see an appreciation that the collective bargaining system and the collective bargaining structures may be, and these are the words of the scenario planning documents that we've dealt with, no longer relevant because of the changing circumstances. And that it did not cater for scenarios where increasing numbers of workers were either non-unionized or had lost confidence in the recognized majority union. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, just to check what you said. You said something about legal agreements. I didn't catch the first bit.
No, I said that the collective bargaining system or structures that was in place at
Yes.
Lonman at the time, in the words of the scenario planning document,
Yeah.
it may no longer be relevant in a situation where you had increasing number of workers
Right.
who were either
Understood.
non-unionized,
So the system.
yes,
And the system was basically the bargaining agreement.
that's correct.
Okay.
It was no longer relevant, did not cater for a situation where you had increasing numbers of workers who were either non-unionized or had lost confidence in the recognized majority union.
Yes.
We see an appreciation that the demand for 12,500 was made by a collection of workers who at that stage could not be said to belong to a particular union. In fact, as Mr. Kwadi recognized, the demand was brought to Mr. Da Costa by workers from both AMCU and NUM. So at that stage, it could not be said to be a demand advanced by a particular union.
Agreed.
Now, despite this, despite the appreciation of the facts I've just outlined to you thus far, at no stage prior to the run-up, at no stage in the run-up to the tragedy of the 16th of August, do we see Lonmin actively negotiating, and we'll deal with Mr. Da Costa's discussions on the allowance, the RDO allowance later. We don't see them admittedly entering into discussions with the strikers around their remuneration,
Correct.
despite an appreciation of the flaws in the system, as it were.
Correct.
And we've seen, Mr. Jamison, that at least by the 18th of July, EXCO was open to considering the possibility of reopening wage negotiations. And it specifically mandated Mr. Mokoena to produce an opinion dealing with the implications of doing so. Now, I'd like to refer you to Exhibit XX3, which is it's the internal communique. We've given you a copy of it.
These two?
Yes. Now, I earlier posed the question to you that on the 18th of July, we see EXCO being open to the possibility of opening wage negotiations. And I asked the question, when was the decision taken that Lonmin would only negotiate through existing bargaining structures? Do you recall that?
Yes.
Now, I want you to look at the internal communique of the 20th of July, 2012. And you'll see this is a communique prepared by Mr. Mokoena. And in that communique, Mr. Mokoena says, and this is 2 days after the Lonmin EXCO meeting, Mr. Mokoena says in paragraph 1,
Sorry, what is this exhibit number?
it's XX3, Chair.
Thank you.
Mr. Mokoena says in paragraph 1, we have noted with great concern the recent demands for increases to wages both within Lonmin and neighbouring mining houses, which have in some instances been accompanied by work stoppages. Management strongly condemns such actions. Do you see that, Mr.
Yes.
Mr. Jamson?
Yes, I see it all.
Yes. Now, that comes 2 days after we know that EXCO asked Mr. Mokoena to produce an opinion dealing with, amongst others, the implications of the RDO demand.
Correct.
And yet 2 days later, we see an internal communique by Mr. Mokoena being released stating that management strongly condemns the RDO demand.
It says management strongly condemns such action.
Yeah, let's look at what the actions are. We have noted with great concern the recent demands for increases to wages both within Lonmin and neighbouring mining houses, which have in some instances been accompanied by work stoppages.
So that's two actions.
All right, so when it says that management strongly condemns such actions,
Yes.
it's not specific to whether it's referring to the work stoppage or the demands. And it seems to encompass
both, I would
absolutely.
say.
It seems to encompass both. Yeah. So, do you have an explanation for why 2 days after EXCO asks Mr. Mokoena to prepare an opinion dealing with the implications of the RDO demand? Let's start there. That's one of the items which he was meant to deal with. why 2 days later you see a communique condemning the RDO demand?
I can offer an explanation, my explanation. I'm not sure whether it's
Yes.
Mr. McQueen's explanation.
No, we'd be grateful for your explanation.
This represents a default position, which is we have structures in place, processes in place, which we don't go outside of. That's the default position. So it's not as if you take a decision to either go outside of those structures or don't. The default is you don't. And I think this is a clear communique that say these structures are in place and these are the ones we will follow. If there's a thinking process going on amongst EXCO at the time of should we or shouldn't we, I don't think that would be communicated. So this represents, I think, the position of the signed agreements, and it is not a decision in that only Lonmin or its EXCO can take, because there's other parties to those, I would have thought. Therefore, there's UASA, Solidarity, NUM, and any decision that was contemplated, not taken, would first have to be discussed with them, I would have thought. So that would be my take on this.
Did EXCO ever specifically decide that the default position would be strongly communicated to workers?
No, this is a communication that is not agreed at EXCO. This is something that Barnard would do on his own, and he's quite entitled to.
And where Mr. Mokoena reflects that management strongly condemns such actions, does that reflect the view of EXCO that they considered the RDO demand and condemned the RDO demand?
I would put more emphasis on the work stoppage, personally. That was what would be condemned, because that's can't be condoned. On the demands for increases, I think less. I think what he's really saying is being condemned is the approach outside of structures. However, Mike did, I think, what he should have done, which is talk to his employees.
And as of 20th of July, were there work stoppages at Lonmin?
It says here there were, but I'm not specifically aware of them. But then, as I said, I wasn't there in July, so I would have been playing catch up, and I can't remember that anyone highlighted one to me while I was away, or it was in an email I would have read.
And if there weren't work stoppages in July 2012, then it's quite clear that what was being condemned in this communique was the demand,
Sure.
and not the accompanying work stoppage.
I can't talk first hand about it, sorry.
And just for completion, if I can refer you to XX4, which is a communique dated the 31st of July 2012.
Yes.
Where Mr. Mokoena points out that Lonmin notes, or we note with great concern, the continuing trend of certain groups of employees who insist on engaging management on separate wage negotiations. We at Lonmin have a set practice of wage negotiations which include working through applicable bargaining structures. We wish to reiterate that changes to terms and conditions of employment, including wages, are negotiated centrally through the existing bargaining structures. In terms of our current wage agreement, we will pay wage increases ranging from 8 to 10% on the 1st of October 2012. Any demands will therefore not be tolerated. These unreasonable demands create unnecessary tension in the workplace, pose a serious threat to the stability of our operations, and may lead to employee job losses. We therefore caution employees against any attempt to embark upon unprotected industrial action and intimidation. Any illegal work stoppages and intimidation due to these unreasonable demands for wage increases will be dealt with decisively through the normal disciplinary processes. During this difficult time in the platinum industry, it is critical for all stakeholders to pull together in ensuring the viable future of our company. Now, we know that the EXCO meeting on the 30th of July.
The call. Yes.
Yes, the one where you called in.
Yes.
That was the critical meeting where the decision was taken to grant the so-called RDO allowance of 750 Rand.
Right.
And that decision was taken by EXCO a day before Mr. Mokoena released this internal communique.
Correct.
And yet we don't see any where in this communique, where Mr. Mokoena deals with the RDO allowance. In fact, he focuses on entrenching the existing bargaining structures and doesn't address at all the decision taken by EXCO the previous day to grant an RDO allowance of 750 Rand.
Correct.
Do you have an explanation for why? I mean, I know that it's not your communique, but you were part of EXCO.
The bits that come out to me are the last sentence. Mr. Chairman, that resonates with me because of the MIGDET Platinum Task Team discussions. So, number one, absolutely the platinum industry was in crisis and in distress. Number two, the explanation there that part of this is because of increasing costs, and I think that goes between XX3 and XX4, is it? One of the key drivers identified at MIGDET was that input costs were spiraling above inflation. Productivity was falling. And therefore, the focus by Barnard on that we have wage agreements in place that will be granted, additional costs on top of that are, will hurt the business, I think was very, very fair. The other part was that at MIGDET, if it was discussed once, particularly by the DMR people, or the Minister and the DG, it was a continuing theme at MIGDET to absolutely work to your bargaining structures, your agreements, the LRA, and they asked all of the companies to sign up to that, particularly because at that point there was job losses on the horizon. And that was as I said before, it wasn't a decision-making forum, but it was continually emphasised by the Minister, the DMR, and the organised unions there present. And I think there was a plenary session shortly before this, one where CEOs went. So I deputised in when Ian couldn't make it or Simon couldn't make it. I would go to the meeting. And there was one shortly before this that said, for goodness sake, we're lost if we start to operate outside. And that was very forcefully put by the people there. And there was, I would say, unanimous agreement by all of the CEOs present there to do so. So I guess we had this pressure on us not to do that. And so I think this was responsible. In terms of saying the RDOs were not specifically mentioned, I think they're alluded to certain groups of employees. I mean, to whoever read this, it might not be apparent, but certainly to me it is.
Well, you're correct in the sense that he alludes to the demand by RDOs. That's quite clear. But what I'm putting to you, and what's not dealt with in the communique, is the result of that demand.
Yes,
the RDOs made a specific demand to management, that management considered the demand, and that management reverted with an allowance of 750 Rand.
Yes, agreed.
That is not dealt with in the communique.
My understanding.
In other words, that the demand by the... Can I just finish the question? In other words, that the demand by the RDOs, outside of the existing bargaining structures, that it bore fruit and resulted in the allowance.
My understanding, and again, it was playing catch-up when I got back, so this was anecdotal conversations with Mark or Barnard or someone else who was there, was that had been communicated back, and I know you said we're going to go there, but back through Mike da Costa specifically. This was a communique to the general workforce saying, we reinforce the processes we have and please adhere to them, and the industry's in trouble and we're in trouble. So, please bear that in mind. That's if I read the whole thing, not the certain paragraphs.
So was Lonman hoping to keep from the general worker population that it had given into the RDO demand for more money?
No, I don't think we would. I don't think we were, and I don't think we could. Once something like that happens, it's general knowledge within 5 minutes, I would think.
Now let's deal with this RDO allowance. And as we understand the evidence, the purpose of the allowance was twofold. It was firstly to address the differential between Lonman RDO salaries and those of Implats and Anglo. We've already covered that. That's correct, isn't it? That's one of the reasons for the special allowance, for the RDO allowance.
Go on.
No, if you can confirm the first reason.
Okay, just say that again, sorry.
It was to make up the lag between Lonman's RDO wages and that of Implats and Anglo.
When you say make up, what?
There was a lag between...
Yes, I understand. But when
yes.
you say make up, I mean, I haven't...
It was
I
to
can't recall the numbers.
increase the wages of Lonman RDOs
Yeah.
in order to bring it closer to the wages paid by Implats and Anglo.
Yes, I can't truly say without looking at the numbers, did it make up, which means it would have equaled? Or
Yes,
did
no,
it close the gap, or did it... But it was to approximate to it,
Yes,
because
we
these
know-
things are never exact numbers, because there's other considerations, I think. As
We
to
know
what-
that it didn't
Yeah.
result in an
Okay.
equalization of wages, which just brought it closer to
Yes.
that of Implats and Anglo.
Okay.
But there was a second purpose, and that's the one that I want to put to you now. And the second purpose was that it was to avert any industrial action by Lonman RTOs. Isn't that correct?
I think again, I'll give you the best answer I can to try and help. The gap was clearly a business risk of the fact that we may lose RDOs. It's never been, it's not unusual for Lonmin, and in my recollection they have in the past, reopened wage negotiations under certain conditions, and those have been agreed with the bargaining structures. And we've also given on occasion, and my labelling of this is a market adjustment. That's what I call this. A market adjustment was given to bring things in line with the market that has gone out of line. And you know, I think as we all know, you can't be too far out of line with the market, because then you incur risk.
And one of
So-
the risks which you would
Well, yeah,
incur is the possibility of industrial action.
Well, I think two things. One would be that we would lose RDOs first and foremost, because that would be the obvious thing. If there's vacancies at other mines that are paying higher, they would move. And a second risk is that there could be industrial action around it. But then there's processes and procedures for that, and we would hope we wouldn't get to it.
But both risks that you've identified were significant risks for Lonmin.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, the RDOs are partly your jugular vein. Yeah.
Now, we know that the RDOs were demanding 12,500 rand. We know that Mr. Da Costa recommended to EXCO that it grant us an allowance of 1,000 rand. And we know that EXCO ultimately decided on a 750 allowance. Now, was it considered by EXCO what would happen if the RDOs didn't accept the allowance of 750?
To your first point, so I think there's three questions there. So you first said Mike Da Costa recommended. I think that changed to Mike accepting that there needed to be some kind of study done, and that would take a couple of weeks. That's what I remember. And coming out of that, there would be some conclusion. The conclusion may have been to do nothing and accept the risk. The conclusion may have been to do something. And I think Mike was aligned with that. And Mark Monroe, I think, undertook that exercise with his HR people that were in his department, and obviously together with our own HR people. And then the decision was saying, well, that's all we can do. I can't recall that there was a specific mention of, well, what happens if this is not good enough? Because one would expect if you bring things into line with the market, that should suffice. If you're talking about the risk of, there's clearly another risk, I think, that's underlying what you're asking me, which is, wasn't there a risk that people would then demand to go outside of bargaining structures? There's always that risk. That's a daily risk.
Well, we know that the RDO allowance eventually decided on didn't result in a complete alignment.
Right.
And you accept that.
Yes. Yeah.
And so, in a sense, EXCO was taking a bit of a risk by deciding on an RDO allowance which was still lower than what was necessary to equalize the wages of RDOs at Lonmin with those at Implats and and Anglo?
No, I wouldn't say that. I thought we were reducing a risk. We weren't incurring a risk.
The risk in the sense that what would have happened if RDOs didn't accept the 750 allowance?
I don't think we were asking them to accept it. We were implementing it as a market adjustment.
And when was the allowance implemented?
Wasn't it? No, I don't know the date, I'm sorry. I think it was somewhere in August, in the beginning of August.
The evidence that we have is that the RDO allowance isn't reflected in the August payslips of the RDOs.
Then I best say I don't know.
Now, the question, Mr. Jamison, is would EXCO have considered a higher allowance, even if it's a marginally higher allowance, if the result would have been to avert a strike by RDOs or to prevent a mass exodus of RDOs to other mines?
I don't know, because I wasn't in the detailed discussions that led up to this, so I can't help you there.
Now, what I want to put to you, Mr. Jamison, is even though Lonmin had tried to be technical in the sense that it proposed or decided on an allowance as opposed to an increase in the wages of RDOs, and obviously it did that to try and keep, at least from a formal perspective, within the confines of the bargaining structures. The result of Lonmin's actions was the following: that RDOs made a demand to Lonmin for an increase in remuneration, that Lonmin considered the increase, considered the demand for an increase, and ultimately decided on the payment of money, whether you call it an allowance or an increase in remuneration. The effect was an increase in the amount of money paid to RDOs ultimately. So in that scenario, where you have a demand being made by workers, being considered by management, and resulting in an increase in the money paid to those workers, doesn't that, in all material respects, resemble a negotiation process?
No, it doesn't. And I think you made 3 points there. One is that the RDOs made a demand for 12,500, and then secondly you said Lonmin considered it. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
Lonmin, I think if it considered that demand, it considered it for all of a millisecond. It's simply impossible to grant that. So what Lonmin considered was looking at the position of Lonmin's RDOs in respect of the market, in the knowledge that Anglo and Impala had given these increases, and said, what can we do that can, bridge that gap or get close or do something about it? And the result then was a market allowance, a market adjustment, as I would call it, and that can be granted, and we've granted those at any time, and not just to RDOs, but instrument technicians, lots of other job categories where we found that we're out of sync with the market. So that's what we did. This is not a negotiation, patently.
What we have, Mr. Jamison, is workers coming to Lonmin management with a demand. Let's forget the rand value attached to the demand. They come for a demand for an increase in their remuneration. Yeah. Lonmin receives the demand. The management then take that demand to EXCO.
Right.
EXCO considers that demand. Clearly, at that stage, it completely dismisses 12.5 or 12,500 as an option.
Yes.
It, however, arrives at a lower amount of 750 rand.
It's not a lower amount, it's a market adjustment.
At the end of the day, it amounts to more money in the hands of the RDOs.
Absolutely, yes.
Whether it's because Lonmin wished to align, or because it recognized the demand as a valid demand, or because it wished to prevent its workers from going on strike, or because it wished to prevent its workers from leaving. Ultimately, Lonmin takes a decision which results in more money in the hands of the RDOs.
Correct.
ultimately, Lonmin takes a decision which results in a bigger remuneration to its employees.
To its RDOs.
To its RDOs,
Yes.
to its RDOs, the employees who make the demand. Now, what in that scenario is different from an ordinary negotiation process?
I'm not an expert on negotiation, so you're only taking my opinion, and I'm not involved in negotiations of remuneration for Lonmin. That's not my job. But as a commercial executive, the three things that to me would define, and again, I can't say whether these are general. One is you have to be, to enter into any negotiation, and the ones that I do in my job, you have to have credentials, you have to be legitimate, you have to represent the parties that you say you're representing. Number two, you have to have a mandate. And number three, you would have to be prepared to give and take, as it were. And regardless of the position of the workers who came with that, and I would say it's a demand, I won't split hairs and say it was a grievance, but there was something there. Mike DaCosta had none of those three things. He was the manager at Curie, so he did not represent the bargaining unit. He didn't have the credentials, and he didn't represent that. Number two, he had no mandate. And number three, he had no ability to give and take. So that's my take, but I'm not an expert.
Which is why Mr. DaCosta doesn't either dismiss or accede the demand immediately. Instead, he says, let me take this demand to my EXCO, because in fact that is the legitimate body to consider the demand. And he does in fact take the demand to EXCO. EXCO considers the demand, and EXCO comes back to Mr. DaCosta with a decision. And the decision is not that this amounts the demand for increased remuneration, it has to go through the normal bargaining structures. The decision is, we will give you a 750 allowance.
Yes.
Whether it's an allowance or whether it's an increase in their wages, the net effect is an increase.
I'm sorry, Chairperson, if the witness could just be reminded to give the answer instead of nodding. I know sometimes it's tempting to do that. But just
There are TV cameras here, but the record that we're keeping of the proceedings is not a visual one, but simply a transcript of what's said.
Understood.
So if you nod your head, that doesn't come on the record. So if the answer is yes, let it be yes, and if the answer is no, let it be no. And head shaking and other things won't go on the record, so they won't count.
Understood.
And specifically from the perspective of Mr. Jamison, that's the perspective which we're looking at it from. From the perspective of workers who bring the demand, who have their demand considered, and who get a decision on the demand, which resulted in more money in their hands. I'm putting to you that from their perspective, must have resembled a negotiation in every respect.
Mr. Chairman, sorry if I might just, I've listened to it for a while. We've had a number of strikers talking. We've had a number of the workers who went on strike talking. What we have, and I don't know of any more who are coming as witnesses, what we have now is a proposition to this witness being put, and there have been a number of propositions put in previous cross-examination as well, on a factual issue which has not been backed up by any of the evidence given by any of those strikers. Now, I don't know at the end of the day how one assesses it, but we have something being put up on what would have been in the mind of the workers that did not arise in any of the evidence given by those workers. So the proposition then goes nowhere. It's got to be backed up by evidence, and those parties who might have given that evidence have already given that evidence, and they haven't stated this. For that reason, on the basis that it's not supported by evidence which has already been given, and I don't take the objection in relation to previous witnesses who testified for Lonmin when workers were still to testify, because it might have cropped up. But now we know that there are no more workers coming to testify. And so that proposition doesn't arise.
How do you respond to the objection?
Mr. Chairperson, there are two responses to it. And the first is that we're dealing here with a question of perception in the mind of the workers. But more importantly, my recollection of the supplementary statement of Mr. X is that his view that what transpired on the 10th was a wage negotiation. what transpired in July was a wage negotiation. But I'll get the reference from my learned friend during the lunch adjournment.
May I deal with it,
Yes,
Mr.
ma'am.
Chairman? The first is, what is being put to this witness is perception on the part of the workers. Now, you've heard those workers testify, and they didn't testify to their
Well,
perception.
Mr. X was a worker.
I'll come to Mr. X.
Sorry.
The second point is, if Mr. X had said that, then I'd like to see the context in which he said it, and then we can deal with it.
In his statement, and he confirmed his statement, that he didn't deal with it in his oral evidence, but it is before us as a statement. But may I make a suggestion? It's 12 o'clock. Things have to be looked at. References have to be given and studied. It seems an appropriate stage for us to take the tea adjournment.
Can I just then conclude the point I want to make?
I thought you might like to conclude it after tea when you've seen the reference that
No, I
I've
will,
given you.
but if I might, just so that it may perhaps be dealt with over the tea adjournment as well. There have been, we've had witnesses give evidence for different parties, and amongst them have been a series of witnesses who have given evidence, loosely speaking, for those who were on strike at that point in time. We've had propositions put to Lonman witnesses prior to some of those witnesses having testified, and so of course you could understand the proposition in anticipation of what might be said. But those witnesses have now been testified, and to put anything to witnesses now on the basis of what might or might not have been perceived by those witnesses who were involved and who gave evidence for the striking employees, without them themselves having so testified, is an improper proposition. It's not backed up by evidence, and it will not be backed up by evidence. That evidence is not coming now.
That's a matter we can consider after the adjournment. We'll take the tea adjournment now.
Okay.